Gentleman yields back. Ms. Lee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hemingway, I'd like to return to a subject you spoke about just a moment ago. Several times today, we've heard allegations that election integrity measures are tantamount to voter suppression, and that many of the things that we're talking about here today have some sort of effect that is negative on voter turnout. So I think it's important that we address that and that we address it thoroughly. Would you tell us a little bit more? You know, for example, when I was Secretary of State, quite frequently we were subjected to litigation, activist litigation, insinuating that any of our integrity measures were suppressing the vote, where those lawsuits weren't brought in other states, some of which had more restrictive voting laws than did Florida. So I'm interested in your thoughts about those subjects.
Right. Well, it's interesting also to just think about the context in which we first talk about this. So it is true that a political party, the Democrat Party, actually worked to suppress the black vote throughout the South for decades. And they didn't do it by just like banning outright. They did it through manipulation of election administration in different municipalities. And so people are concerned about that. But it is also true that we have higher, voter turnout now than we've had in a very long time. People are doing and that caring about election integrity is an important part of our entire self-governance system. We need to be sure that people who are voting are legal and eligible to vote, and that when you have people who are voting who might not fit certain categories, it actually disenfranchises legal and eligible voters. So it's actually important to care about it for all of our sakes. We want to make sure that our votes are not devalued by having improper voting. But also, as I mentioned earlier, when you have the modest election integrity reforms that were passed by Georgia and Florida, you saw a huge increase. It is worth noting, too, that when Georgia passed these modest reforms, the President of the United States asked people to boycott the state of Georgia. Certain companies did. Major League Baseball pulled the game from there. Other major companies pulled out of Georgia. And the result was that Georgia had an improved voting system with greater participation. And I don't know if we've heard apologies from some of those companies yet.
I don't believe that we have. And another thing that I think is interesting, I believe we have some consensus here that, if we are to ban private funds to support elections officials, that there is a need to take a look at what do they need? What should these funds be spent on? What were they spending? Was it voting systems? Was it to the extent it was valid things that they need to do their jobs effectively, is there a role for the federal government in supporting that? But one thing that I think we've seen with past federal support of state and local election officials is proscriptive language about how dollars can be spent. Rather than saying, here's this money, we're going to support you, you can use it as you see fit. If you're an urban area, if you're a rural area, those needs might be different. There have been limitations and restrictions on how those HAVA dollars and federal funds can be spent. Dr. Flanders, I'll start with you. Do you have any thoughts on that? And if we were to try to engage in supporting state and local election officials, how should we do so?
Yes, I think there was some discussion earlier about whether this is a state issue or whether this is a federal issue, right? And I think that we always have to be cognizant of federal strings that come with any new election funding. But I think the important thing here is when we discuss the notion of private funding, I think we need to recognize the remedy comes from more public funding, whether it comes from the federal level or the state level. It's certainly a question to debate. And obviously, I think as a conservative libertarian leaning organization, we'd probably prefer that come from the state level to the extent possible. But the important thing is let's get the private funds out, and then we can determine where the best source of state and local funds is.
And Ms. Hemingway, any comment from you on that subject?
It's just worth noting that different people vote in different ways, and that minor changes and subsidies toward one type of voting over another can actually have a dramatic partisan impact because of those differences.
All right, and then finally, because I get to go last in our committee, I'm interested, Ms. Hemingway, is there anything that we haven't asked you today that you think it is important for this committee to know as we go forward doing our work?
I don't know, but I do want to say that if people truly care about conspiracies with elections, that I hope that the people on the other side of the aisle here cared as much about the false and dangerous conspiracy theory that Donald Trump stole the election by conspiring with Russia, which was something that was embraced by powerful people throughout that party. And I hope that the people on this committee renounce that, because that caused a lot of damage and problems for our country.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman